Hello, guys. Welcome to our today's podcast. Today, we will take a look at cognitive bias and disinformation in the context of the current Russo-Ukrainian war. The podcast will be divided into two sections. In the first one, we will talk about disinformation in general and the way Russia deals with the phenomenon. In the second part, we have invited an expert on the cognitive bias and on the psychological aspect of disinformation. My name is Michal.
My name is Paola.
My name is Vivien. The first person we're going to talk to is Jonas Syrovatka.
And the second speaker is going to be Christopher Paul.
So for the first part of this podcast, we're going to focus mainly on disinformation and how and in what ways it has been affecting the current Russia-Ukrainian conflict. For this section of the podcast, we have invited Professor Jonas Syrovatka, who is a senior fellow from the Prague Security Studies Institute Regional Security Program. First things first, thank you for joining us. If you would like to explain more in detail what your field of study is and what you do, and then we can go into details about the topic.
Yeah, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me. Very happy to be part of this project. Well, I'm basically leading the program, or I was leading until very recently the program that was focusing on disinformation at the think tank Prague Security Studies Institute. And within the framework of my work, we kind of covered various topics, being it election and disinformation, Russian influence operations, perception of public towards disinformation, and so on.
Perfect, thank you very much. So now we can start with the general questions. So could you maybe introduce us with a brief explanation on the concepts of misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, I think that's actually very crucial to do at the very beginning, because oftentimes it's kind of perceived that we all understand what we are talking about, and it's clear what these terms mean. But if you actually are looking into the public debate in Czech Republic, but I would think that elsewhere is quite similar. Very oftentimes you can find out that these terms are kind of used interchangeably or kind of used within appropriate context and so on. So I think it's very important to kind of fix that at the very, very beginning. So basically, disinformation is like falsehood that is spread intentionally. That basically someone makes up certain information and then spreads it in order to manipulate the target audience. However, misinformation is, let's say, the claims which is incorrect or untrue, but is spread, let's say, unintentionally, or it kind of spreads without the knowledge that it's false, and therefore then the motivation behind it, it's not kind of malicious, but it is rather kind of mistake or error. Error and result of, for example, I don't know, bad fact checking or not interested in fact checking at all. So I think it's these two differences is very important to distinguish. Also, for example, from the legal perspective, because when we are kind of talking about persecuting someone for spreading disinformation, we are not talking about persecuting someone simply for lying, but also for having certain malicious intent.
Okay, thank you. So to the second question, why do you think then that disinformation and fake news are so easily spread? And how could we prevent disinformation?
Yeah, well, maybe I would kind of start again here. I would little, let's say, again, terminological note. Yeah, that I would be rather cautious with the term fake news, because it is one of those terms that is kind of, like disinformation, which is term which is kind of pretty established in the research community, and you can have find quite a lot of debates about it in the in the academic literature. The term fake news is rather new, and it's rather vague, and and even though disinformation as a term are used, and I would argue in problematic fashion already, fake news is is so general and so kind of so vague term that is kind of even invites people to kind of misuse it for their own purposes. Yeah? So I would maybe just start with this kind of notion, like be mindful of of the limits of term fake news. But as far as the spread is concerned, basically when we are looking at a situation in an information environment, we kind of it is not only that falsehoods are spreading quickly, it is that informations are spreading quickly, that due to the internet interconnectivity, due to the fact that each of us can become, let's say, the source of information himself from his own, let's say, from his own environment, and can share it with other users who can reshare it later on. That means that kind of all of the information are kind of spreading way faster than in the past. And maybe I would argue that actually the let's say the fast spread of disinformation maybe is not such a big problem, but only becomes a big problem when we are kind of able to let's say to assess or like able to establish that disinformation are changing the behavior of the people on the ground, which again it might be kind of get a bit more complicated. But since we are kind of talking how to limit the spreading, then like the solution lies within within the lines of communications we are using. So basically, then we have to kind of thinking like how to regulate, for example, social media, how to regulate some other communication channels, which is again like also like very tricky, because we are kind of getting into a bit uncharted territory, and we still have to kind of negotiate what is kind of acceptable and what isn't acceptable.
Okay, well, you mentioned that social media has applied already some methods to which we can prove whether disinformation is true or not. But do you think that disinformation is so easy to spread because there are some certain aspects that are very much working with social media, like photoshopped photos or some sort of methods that make people believe in disinformation so easily?
Yeah, I think that like bit with your examples, you bit suggested this kind of like looking into this kind of technical aspect. It's and this kind of debate. We have like your doctored images, made up events, artificially created videos, deepfakes, and everything. And these technological wonders, of course, are like at the same time like quite fascinating, because we can see like how far the modern technology can go, but at the same time also like very disturbing, because again we have like this video and we are kind of fixed in this idea actually what is in the video is kind of real, because that's basically the projection of reality. But now this very assumption is questioned, and we are kind of becoming like very uncertain, and and therefore from this anxiety of what the reality actually is, I think also kind of sparks this overall focus on the technological side. But I would argue that okay, it's important, definitely, but at the same time I think that it doesn't appreciate enough the role of view of, let's say, of the receiver. Yeah, because we as receivers are kind of co-creating, let's say, our information in an information diet, and we are kind of we are choosing which channels we want to follow, which information we want to believe, and which topics we would like to be focused on, and and also like which emotions we want to experience, or which emotions are kind of attracting us. And there is like this very famous often like misunderstood research of MIT, which is kind of saying basically that like falsehoods are spreading like, I don't know, 6 or 7 times like faster than, let's say, than the real information on the social media. And in the discussion of this article, the author saying, okay, we kind of found that, but we don't know the reason, and we don't think that the reason is that the falsehoods are kind of that basically that there is only this kind of binarity, yeah, and they are kind of suggesting maybe we might want to be kind of taking a look into spread of the, let's say, the news that are kind of more kind of emotionally loaded, which falsehoods they were tested usually were, because it was kind of something like new. People were kind of like surprised, and since it was something kind of new for them, they were more prone to react to it and share it than something that they will say, okay, they will think, okay, that's kind of normal. Why, how oftentimes do you share on the social media, I don't know, like regular news about the state budget, or about the, about the statement of the prime minister, or about, about anything, yeah. But if you found the, if you see the information, I don't know, our prime minister was poisoned, for example, then you are kind of, wow, that's interesting. That's something worth sharing, yeah. So basically, I think that to sum it up, I think that aside of these technological things, we have to very much look into, let's say, the emotional resonance of these particular topics, because I think that they explain this part kind of explain us very well why people react to them and share them further.
Yeah. So in relation to that, do you think that then people choose to ignore that they can fact check every single article that they share? Because in Western countries, it's much easier to fact check than in autocratic regimes.
Well, I mean, that's first, maybe I would kind of question your assumption here, because I mean, like for us, it's not that easy to fact check. Yeah, that, if you are kind of, like the fact checking is very kind of tedious and difficult work. If you are kind of taking a look as a rule of fact checkers, it's like, you have to like have different sources, and you have to kind of, look on the problem from various different angles, and then like, the line between, I don't know, completely correct and like misleading or partly correct, it can be like very blurry even for them. Yeah, so it's not easy discipline. Yeah, so we should not pretend that we are kind of, that the fact checking is easy in the first place, and we shouldn't pretend that we as individuals are kind of, fact checking all the time, like every information we receive. Yeah, it's kind of more the other way, that we are kind of having some sort of information diet, and based on our previous experiences, or like, or the let's say ideological preferences or whatever, we are creating the sources of information, we are having, and then, because it was said by my favorite commentator, or because it was written on media I trust, therefore I trust it. I don't kind of check that further. And even more so, I am able to do it only in a very kind of slim percentage of information I get, because the majority of, majority of topics I'm not expert, and I don't have to be an expert. Yeah, I mean, like, for example, I don't know, like, okay, so there is some there, I should pay my taxes, for example. So, I don't know, I kind of, I ask somebody who understands it. I don't kind of try to fact check, like, how the payment of taxes should kind of go, and everything what I should do, and so on. Yeah. And on top of that, if you look at the researchers, there is like, I don't know, like from 20 to 40% of Czechs have no idea from where they are getting their information. They just, they are not that much interested at the first place about what is actually happened in society and politics, and therefore, they are kind of having only a vague idea what is actually happening, and they are not able to kind of pinpoint one information source that they are kind of, that they are using. So it's kind of like, then, you cannot even, and then if you find out that for a significant part of people, like the fact checking itself is not an issue. Like, the issue is, to create some sort of, I don't know, basic, like, and media literacy isn't like even the, maybe like the media literacy, yeah, but basically basic awareness about, like, how you should approach, let's say, the information in general.
That was really interesting, actually, because I do believe that fact checking maybe is not as easy as it is, or maybe it's not up to us, or maybe it's up to the news media to do a bit more of that, and not us. But one last question before we move to more specifics. Do you believe then that maybe autocratic and regime states are overall more skilled in implementing disinformation techniques than Western countries? And is there a reason?
I mean, yeah, I mean, yes, but I would here like, kind of suggest the broader perspective, because when we are talking about disinformation, we are talking about like only very kind of slim percentage of, of the communication of authoritarian regimes after. It's kind of, again, disinformation, like problems again, like this term is kind of used to basically to label anything almost. So, so I would really kind of clearly distinguish that on a certain level you have like the disinformation and the mean of manipulation, and on let's say on a bit kind of, higher on the level of abstraction, you have the propaganda as this kind of like general attempts to basically, craft the public perception in certain manner. You kind of, wish the public would, let's say, understand the things from, and of course like favorable for you as a government. And here, of course, like the autocratic regimes are way more successful because it is basically in their structure that they are using propaganda. While in democracies, we have like this kind of idea that basically open debate and open competition of ideas is, is kind of sacred, and it's like this kind of foundation due to which we are able to have like this kind of meaningful deliberation and accommodation of interest and everything. In authoritarian regime, this is exactly the opposite. That basically the goal is unity, being it to united behind the ideology, or united behind the leader, or be united behind certain like national idea or whatever. And if you want to reinforce it, this particular idea, then you of course have to have like like elaborated kind of propaganda machine that can kind of do manipulate various things. And since you are kind of doing that as your daily practice, you of course can be like more easily like in technical sense, it's more easy for you to also kind of include this information into your toolkit. And moreover, you have like no ethical restraints. Yeah, so it's like so not only so you don't ask yourself this question like whether this is like good way to behave in the democratic manner, and there are no kind of opponents, political or media or fact checkers or whatever, who could kind of call you out and say this is unacceptable, because like in autocratic societies, the elite are deciding what is acceptable and what isn't.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Now we are gonna just move into a more specific topic, which is the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and Vivien, you can take it from there.
Exactly. So could you tell us maybe a couple of facts that are interesting to know, or actually important to know, about the long history of the fascist disinformation?
Yeah, it's actually pretty long long subject. Again, like Russia has like long tradition of being, I spoke in previous answer about autocratic regimes in general, and Russia has a long history of being basically different kind of non-democratic regimes, starting with like monarchy, then like say Bolshevik totalitarian regime, until like current personalized autocracy. So basically you have there like this kind of lot of, basically the Russian political elites are, let's say, using the manipulation, to kind of, control their like, their people, like propaganda, including manipulation, to control, let's say, their subject for very, very long time. So you have that something, that's it's kind of, present in basically Russian political life in various like, strange ways. The second thing is when we are speaking specifically about disinformation, that you have like quite a lot of institutional knowledge. That itself, like the word disinformation, is actually coming from Russian, and it was referring to basically one of the offices of Secret Service that was tasked with information operation that should deceive its opponents abroad. So you have like the people, let's say you have, let's say, institution, and this institution didn't really change. It's kind of there is like a lot of, let's say, basically, like a lot of, let's say, a lot of continuity between like, being it, and even back there in the Soviets, but also like Soviet and like current Russian secret services. So of course have like, this kind of, learning process in place, so that helps you as well. And last important thing, you have also like the, at the same time, like Russia is able to kind of adapt to the new, let's say, to the new environment and take take some practices that are present in the West. Yeah? Because, for example, if you kind of look at the RT, this is not some sort of heavy-handed Soviet-style propaganda, but this is like very kind of this is very kind of modern modern television that kind of takes inspiration from the Western Western commercial television, and by doing so it can be like so it can like so successful, it would be probably overstatement, but it can it is able to kind of found its place on global media market. And then in one of the last important things is basically that Russian political leadership has the political will to apply like propaganda and disinformation. Basically, they are kind of seen as a as an important tool for let's say for achieving their political goals. So they are not very shy to use that or encourage various structures within the Russian state to kind of to use it.
Okay, thank you very much. Why do you think are people who live in Russia, or generally people on the right-wing spectrum, so prone to believe in disinformation?
Yeah, I would be here like a bit careful, because like, okay, because when you are testing who is prone to believe disinformation, it very much depends on which kind of disinformation you are testing. If you are like over, like in last 5-6 years, the debate, for understandable reason, were kind of very much kind of moving around the disinformation that were basically like anti-liberal, anti-US, and so on. Yeah. So so if you are kind of taking this angle, then of course you kind of found like overrepresentation of people, people living in Russia believing that kind of that US is some kind of evil empire, or like people on the right side, let's say on the right side of political spectrum, who are kind of believing that, for example, I don't know, like European Union is planning like the population of Europe. So that's kind of logical, because we are kind of using the statements which may resonate among them. But if you look at all the researches, for example, from United States, you could see that basically all, like both, let's say both parties, being it Republicans and Democrats, and they're like especially core supporters, were basically keen on certain kind of conspiracy theories. Only the content was like a bit different. Yeah, that on the right, let's say among the Republicans, you have like you had a higher number of, let's say, this kind of, I don't know, birthers who are kind of questioning whether like Barack Obama was born in the United States. And on the left side, among the core Democrats, you have like more more stories about basically conspiracies, about conspiracies of capitalists and conspiracies of banks, and so on. Yeah. So I would be a bit careful here and kind of say that basically like each extreme, being it ideological, religious or whatever, is having it's all it's kind of in the danger of kind of filling into gap of the conspiratorial thinking. And to be honest, like even like the liberal extreme, liberal extreme, if I can kind of use this kind of on the first sight, like illogical connection, has like has some dangers as well. Yeah, because I think that for many people, this kind of Russian plot of Russian services and like incredible power of Russian trolls and everything become like very good kind of excuse for not looking into some other reasons which might kind of cause, I don't know, election results or whatever. So we have to be kind of really really cautious.
Yeah, you mentioned we just talked, for example, about right-winged people believing disinformation, and it's kind of relating to that what I want to ask. In this conflict, we're talking about Russia, and now Russia is doing disinformation. Do you think that Ukraine is implementing its own disinformation propaganda, as in Ukraine saying, oh yeah, we're being successful in this war, but in reality, maybe it's not like that?
I mean, like I would start with first instance. I mean, every state, you know, do like you know, like do like basically everything in order to survive. Yeah. So if you are kind of in an exceptional situation, you are doing like exceptional steps which are kind of outside of legal framework, or maybe can be like ethically like very questionable. But you know, like for if you are thinking from that kind of state perspective, you know, like you know, do the greatest, like do the greatest good, and like the you know ultimate how should I say it, like let's say ultimate justification for every step is kind of survival of the state as a structure. So in that sense, like basically any country in the situation in which the Ukraine is now would resolve to you know to the steps which are very problematic in, let's say, in the normal times. And if I kind of limit that on like on this kind of information space, any state would definitely start to apply its own propaganda. Any state would restrict the work of the foreign journalists. Any state would start, you know, would try to manipulate, you know, to manipulate the public image in, you know, in order to look good, and you know, try to vilify the enemy in order, you know, to kind of, you know, to look as a kind of right side. And yeah, you know, this is not something that would kind of, you know, would Ukraine invent. If you look at United States and its approach to wars in Iraq, or if you look at United Kingdom and war on Falklands, I mean, these are the things that you are just do because you want to win the war. So yes, for sure, like Ukraine is kind of applying its own propaganda and trying to kind of, you know, craft the image, you know, to its advantage. And as far as we kind of can we can see it, they are doing it like quite effectively. And I would argue that one of the reasons why they might be that effective is that they are actually very cautious in applying disinformation. That they are that they are like trying to kind of craft this kind of positive image, and they are kind of, you know, sharing these terrible story, you know, trying to kind of provide us with as much information about these kind of terrible stories that are kind of happening, or they are kind of, you know, try to maybe exaggerate, but you know, but kind of, you know, show certain figures about like the Russian military. So you know, so these are not kind of like disinformation in this sense that they would made up, like the massacre of civilians, which unfortunately they didn't have to, because the massacres are kind of happening, but they kind of have a lot of materials to work with already. Yeah. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, like, you know, here it's kind of also like shows like certain, you know, that certain important truth about propaganda, that the propaganda is not about lying. Propaganda is about, let's say, spin doctoring, you know, the existing image or kind of selection of, you know, the facts in order that will, you know, show your side in the good, you know, in the good, in a good sense. Yeah. So yeah. So that's that.
Yeah. No. That was very good. Thank you. One last question. It's basically regarding the conflict in general. Would you say that disinformation and propaganda are playing a major role in this current conflict, or is it just like how these type of conflicts nowadays go, that social media, it's a major part?
Yeah, I think that's you know, I mean, major. I mean, like this is like important, but it's kind of one of the components of, you know, of many you know, of many things. I mean, like if Ukraine wouldn't have, you know, what, you know, Ukraine is kind of creating like very good, you know, very good, like, you know, influence campaign to kind of, you know, to shape the public perception in Western countries. But why Ukraine does that? Because it, for example, like specific goals, it doesn't want that we like them, but it wants us to deliver them weapons. So, you know, so here you can see like the interaction of these basically two, you know, of these two or like basically of these two components, like very kind of very kinetic component of, you know, of tank deliveries, and like, you know, this kind of, you know, this kind of general component of propaganda. Vice versa, Russian, or let's say Russian state media try to create the image of kind of, you know, Ukrainians as some kind of, you know, puppet state, and like, you know, full of you know, psychopaths and extremists, in order to kind of, you know, suppress any dissent against the war at home, and to maintain, you know, maintain the stability of the regime. So, and again, like, this is important, but at the same time, it doesn't seem to kind of helping that much on the front lines. Russia, where like this kind of hardware will be hardware and military tactics will be deciding in the end, and also like of course the state of economy and everything. So basically, this is like quite complex picture of the things you have to do in order to kind of win the war. And propaganda is kind of only one of them. It's working in interaction. And I think that's maybe it's good lessons about how to talking about how to think about propaganda even further. Yeah, that propaganda is not something that you just do because you are, I don't know, evil authoritarian regime or whatever. Yeah, you are kind of investing quite a lot of money and building infrastructure for spreading propaganda because you want to achieve particular political goals. We cannot have the discussion about the propaganda somewhat, disregarding the overall strategy or overall like political aims. I think that's very important.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for your discussion today. And that wraps up, I think, our first part in the podcast. Now that we're taking a look into disinformation and how that plays a role into the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, we're going to focus about psychological aspects of it, and we're going to see how they relate to the particular conflict, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So for the second part of this podcast, we are going to focus on political psychology topics such as cognitive bias and how they relate on disinformation in the Russian and Ukrainian conflict. And so today we have invited Dr. Christopher Paul, a senior social scientist from University of California. And first of all, thank you for joining us today. And
yeah, happy to join you.
If you would like to introduce yourself and what your field of studies, then we can go from there.
Yeah, so I guess the work that I've done that's relevant is my colleague Miriam Matthews and I did a study in 2016 on Russian propaganda and why it works, especially Russian falsehood-based propaganda. So the study is called the Russian fire hose of falsehood propaganda model, why it works and what we can do about it, or something like that. So that's the base of research I'll draw on for our conversation today.
It's perfect. Thank you. Michael, you can take from there.
Okay, so as Paola already mentioned, we would like to focus on the concept of cognitive biases and negativity biases. Could you just briefly introduce us to the topic?
Sure. So there's lots of forms of bias that we as humans experience. Some of them have historically been useful, ways that human animals running around the forest manage to recognize traps and dangers and hazards in the world, or quickly figure out who's going to be friendly and who's going to be an enemy. Mm-hmm. Famous social psychologist Daniel Kahneman often refers to system 1 and system 2 thinking, or thinking fast and thinking slow. So there's the things that we do that are called heuristics, that are mental or cognitive shortcuts that help us get through a day with too much information in it. And then there are the things that are really engaged in attention, things that we thoughtfully think about. And usually when we're engaged and we're being thoughtful, we're much less likely to be biased. But our thinking fast systems, our heuristics, our shortcuts, they're much more vulnerable to bias. So if we're biased about something, we maybe make a choice or have a preference that would not necessarily stand up to cold, cool, calm, rational scrutiny.
Okay. Do you feel like biases and those sort of shortcuts are still more useful than being a burden to us right now? Or do you think that it has sort of warped and changed?
Yeah, I think given the safety of the modern environment, where we don't have to worry about a lion jumping out from behind a tree, or we don't have to worry about another caveman stabbing us with a spear if we mistake them for a friend rather than an enemy, that oftentimes our biases do us less good than the harm that they cause. Mm-hmm. But too bad, because some of our biases we can combat, but we can't constantly roll around in system 2 thinking and thinking slow. It's just too mentally taxing. So we're stuck with our heuristics. And oftentimes those don't serve us well. Those give biases that make us believe things that we shouldn't, or make us make choices that aren't fair or otherwise wouldn't stand up to rational scrutiny.
Okay. When you said that we can combat some of those biases, how can we do that? How do you suggest we approach that?
It's tricky. Some of it involves being aware of the biases. So if you're a thoughtful person and you recognize that you have certain biases, then either that can trigger you to go to system 2 thinking, to slow down and be more thoughtful about it some of the time, or to double check your work, to go back and say, well, wait a minute, did I approach this in a fair way? Did my shortcut reasoning work properly? Other ways to protect it is we can try to protect each other. If we increase the demands on journalists or news providers so that they are less likely to trigger shortcuts that might result in biases, or things to do with social media. And so one of the challenges in the propaganda space has to do with people sharing stories via social media that may or may not be true, and people looking at those stories that aren't true and not realizing that they're not true and building those not facts into their worldview. Whereas if something were to trigger them to more thoughtful thinking, their confirmation bias, their willingness to believe something that they've already started to believe, or the things that trigger confirmation bias. I'm sure you've heard of the first mover advantage. So that's where whoever shares information first, if someone believes that information, then it's much harder to dislodge. So if right when something is first shared, if it isn't true, if there's some mechanism in place to cause people to be more thoughtful just for a moment and realize, maybe that's not true, then maybe it doesn't lodge in their consciousness in the first place.
So do you think that it's instinctive, or that people choose not to believe or not to think about the fake news that they get in the media?
So you're excuse me, you're asking how much of it is conscious and how much of it is unconscious. And I don't know what the balance is. I know some of it is unconscious, but I think at some point there has to be, at least in my view, kind of a willing ignorance. So there may be, but I don't know where the tipping point is, right? Because if you've created a media bubble for yourself, where you an echo chamber, where you only hear people who think like you do, who believe the kinds of things that you do, you get this kind of self-reinforcing set of views. Maybe you didn't consciously create that. Maybe a social media company helped you create that. Maybe your favorite news station helped you create that. But once you've been immersed in that for a while, I don't know the point at which you're ever consciously choosing to stay in it. And if you've heard nothing but the same ridiculous conspiracy theories for months or years on end, when some new ridiculous conspiracy theory comes along, is it just the biases that you built for yourself that cause you to accept it, or is there a conscious choice to believe something ridiculous? I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. But also, like, between all the confirmation, all the biases that we have, do you think confirmation biases amongst all of them is the one that plays a major role in believing this information? Because it, of course, assures what we already believe.
I think confirmation bias is a huge one. And it connects, as I mentioned already, to first mover advantage. Because with first mover advantage, once you come to believe something, it's baked into your worldview, and it's really hard to convince you otherwise because of confirmation bias. So maybe there's something that I don't know anything about, and then there's the first piece of news about it, and that may not be true news. And now I know something about it. And now if you come and try to tell me something else, unless I'm really thoughtful and trying to be open-minded and fighting against my own confirmation bias, I'm going to be like, well, wait a minute, that's not what I heard.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be reactive. I'm going to be resistant. So confirmation bias is huge. Another important bias is what's called blind spot bias. when I'm talking to people about human vulnerabilities to propaganda, I'm very careful to point out that it's all humans. It's you, it's me. And I've regularly had this feeling sitting in or standing in front of an audience, or even in front of a Zoom or Skype audience, talking about human vulnerabilities to being deceived or manipulated. And I can feel people in the audience looking to their left and the right and going, oh, all you poor, stupid humans. And they forget about themselves. Blind spot bias is this assumption that you personally are somehow special and immune to these human vulnerabilities. And it's all the other humans that have the problem. Well, guess what, fellow humans? It's you too. All of us have these vulnerabilities. All of us, when we're thinking fast, we have these heuristics, we're vulnerable to bias, we're vulnerable to manipulation.
Okay, that was really interesting. Thank you for the more general part. Now to connect it to some current events, sadly we have to talk about the Russian and Ukrainian conflict and situation. You've already sort of tapped into this, into the role of social media and internet. I would like to ask, do you think that the importance and the role that the internet plays right now, does it support the biases? Does it, really push into them, or does it help us some sort of overcome them?
I think right now, on balance, social media supports biases. Again, the way social media promotes the creation of echo chambers, whether intentionally through the algorithms, you may like this content. Well, the reason you may like this content is because it's like other content that you have sought out, which is primarily confirmation bias, or the way you can choose who to follow and who to block so that you have the opportunity to support your biases and choose to follow people who seem like you or have the same kind of ideas as you do, and to block people from whom you might learn something or you might see a contradictory view. You end up with this echo chamber where you only hear confirmatory things.
Do you think that we should hold the social media responsible and accountable for this? Because what happened in Czech Republic, actually, after the conflict started, the government decided to block certain webs that have proven like ties to the Russian government. Is that the right way, in your opinion? I know that it's a whole other topic.
It's really complicated and really tricky, but in some cases, yes. But I have to give it a qualified yes, because it's tricky to figure out exactly what rules or regulations you want social media entities to follow. I think it would be better if there was a civil and private and government partnership, that if we all accepted, hey, there's problems, there's danger to humans in these kinds of social networks. What can we all do together to reduce those risks? I think the social media companies would make better partners if they accepted some responsibility and tried to do things to help make this better, rather than the government either shutting them off or saying, here is exactly how we want you to do better at this, because then that lets the social media companies step back and say, well, you have rules, we're following the rules. We're following the rules. What do you want us to do? Well, okay, I want you to help us figure out what the right rules are. I want you to take responsibility for this and help try to protect humans from their own human weaknesses and from bad actors who are trying to manipulate or deceive them. And I think the social media companies are better at picking out bad actors than they've necessarily let us know. Now, sometimes they're doing things like removing inauthentic accounts, but I think there's more that they could do if they were incentivized to do so, not necessarily told you must do, but made part of a system where it's better for them. And some of that comes from the users. If there was a social media platform that's brand was truth and authenticity, maybe people would vote with their feet and would congregate to a social media platform where user accounts are authentic and verified and bad actors are purged and propaganda is removed or labeled. And if there were market forces, but that would mean that people had to want that and had to create monetary value for the social media company to do that. So I can see what I would like to see, but how we get there, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
In relation to that, since we're talking about social media limiting Russian propaganda in the West, how do you think in Russia, what is Russia using as a psychological standpoint to prove their people that their actions are the ones that are the good ones in this case?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So it's easy here in the West to forget that the main audience for Russian propaganda is Russians. And here we're also used to this modern information age with the internet and all kinds of access to all kinds of information all the time. That's not so much the case in Russia. Russia has always had a fairly tightly controlled state media apparatus for journalism, and their internet isn't wide open. And especially since the Ukraine conflict, they've blocked a bunch of different social media sites. I think there's been a huge upsurge in Russian downloading of virtual private network software so they can get onto the broader internet and not be observed. But again, it comes back to confirmation bias and first mover advantage. So if you're a Russian living in Russia and you have been listening to Russian state-controlled media for your entire life, and all kinds of ridiculous claims about fascists and Banderites and other kinds of bad actors in Ukraine and drug-addled Ukrainian dictators has been spoon-fed to you for years and years and years, then when the Russian government says, oh, we're going to conduct a special military operation to liberate the poor people of Ukraine from their evil government, sounds possibly plausible because you haven't heard alternative narratives, you've been fed that one a lot. That's how that works.
Yeah, basically, I mean, I've seen it it's a recurring pattern, it seems, in all like autocratic states that propaganda is so successful. So why is it so successful? Is it just confirmation bias and limiting resources, or is it there is some other psychological reasoning behind it?
And there are lots of different psychological factors, and I think first mover advantage and confirmation bias. So there are a whole bunch of different things that make information persuasive, whether it's true or not. Repetition, familiarity, receiving it from multiple different sources, receiving information. So that in the studies of persuasion, the single most persuasive force is receiving information from someone like you. And I'm making air quotes because because what dimension of likeness is mobilized can be all kinds of different things. It can be someone who speaks the same language as you, that could make them like you. Or it could be someone who is a fan of the same sports team as you are, or who claims to have grown up in the same place. Because again, on the internet, what you claim and what's true isn't necessarily the same thing, but people who have an avatar that looks like your favorite sports team, or people who have an avatar that looks like someone you might like in a personable way, someone who's attractive or friendly looking, someone who likes the same movies or comedians that you do. There's all kinds of different ways that likeness can be mobilized. So that's a hugely important factor. But presumably, Russian speakers who receive propaganda from Russian state-controlled media or through Russian social media channels are more likely to encounter projectors, speakers who they think are like them than the occasional Western broadcast that they're able to get a hold of. So that's a big factor. So confirmation bias, we already mentioned, just all these different things, and whether or not something is true has a very small effect on its persuasiveness. So these other things, availability, frequency, these things are all much more important.
That's perfect, thank you.
All right, I think that we've almost reached the given time. Is there anything you would like to add? Some like important aspect that we didn't have time for, you think deserves spotlight?
Just to have more conversations about what we might do about propaganda. So I think it's important that we recognize that we have these human vulnerabilities, and to try to take steps personally and in terms of policy to help reduce them. So that could involve a combination of things, including better civics education and better media consumption education, both for ourselves because of blind spot bias, but for our children and for other citizens. And then better efforts by partnerships between the governments, between private sector entities, between firms that provide social media information to try to reduce the flows of propaganda and to point out, to try to help people engage their system to slower thinking when something might or might not be true. Whether that's requiring a confirmation when someone goes to forward some story that has been fact checked, just to pop up something and say, hey, the story you're sharing has been fact checked as false. Are you sure you want to proceed? So that still leaves people free to say, yes, I do. I want to share this fake news, but maybe stop people for a moment going, oh, really? It isn't. Well, maybe I won't. So just something to slow the spread, help people engage their system to thinking. And I'm sure there are other things we could talk about in that space, but it's not hopeless. We are disadvantaged because humans have certain vulnerabilities, but there are ways that we can help protect each other if we try.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good talk, and at least we know a bit more about how psychological assets affect disinformation. Yeah, that was all, I think.
All right.
Thank you for your time.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope that was a useful conversation. Good questions, and I enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day.
All right, so now that we have talked to both of the speakers, what did you guys find the most interesting, Paola?
Yeah, I would say that the first speaker, Professor Jonas, he really highlighted really well the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And I think that what Russia is doing right now is disinformation and disinformation propaganda. So I thought that was really important to highlight really early on in the podcast.
Maybe it is also nice to see that a lot of people are spreading misinformation because they all think it is true. And there's just a couple of people, just a small group of people that really just spread disinformation, and they know that it is not true. And I think that is not right.
Yeah, to be honest, something that really struck me as really interesting and something that I will definitely remember is when Chris talked about blind spot bias, because I found myself like in that position when we learn about these sort of things. I always think, oh yeah, people do this. And it's not just people, it's me as well. And this recording, this podcast really helped me to understand that.
Both speakers, they talked a lot about the internet and the relationship between the internet and biases. So what do you guys think is this actual relationship between the internet and biases, or social media and the biases?
All right, so what I think is interesting, when we talked to Chris, we were sort of, exploring how we developed those biases. And that happened when we didn't have internet and when we lived in a completely different era, different conditions. So I'm really curious to see, how do humans adapt to that? Like, is our nature going to change according to this, or are we going to stay vulnerable just like we are now? That's what I'm really curious about.
Yeah, and I think that I think they both talked about social media and how that influences disinformation. And I think that's because cognitive bias really play a part in disinformation and how people react to it. Because when people see on social media that their favorite news outlet is posting about something that they really care about, then they're automatically going to believe in it. And I think without social media, that wasn't as common. So I think we chose cognitive bias because it was a topic that really influenced disinformation in our opinion. So I think they both did well in showcasing that.
So I think this is a wrap on our podcast. I think we've gathered some very interesting thoughts about this topic. I hope you all enjoyed it, and Thank you from all of us and from the speakers.